Marcus stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform crisp and perfectly pressed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as tourists gathered with their cameras, eager to capture photos of the famous guards. But Marcus knew what they were really looking at. Not his pristine uniform or his stoic expression. They were staring at the scars. The jagged white lines ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a map of violence etched permanently into his skin. Some scars were thin and precise, others thick and irregular. They told a story he wished he could forget but carried with him every single day. The tourists whispered among themselves, pointing and giggling. Some took photos when they thought he wasn't looking. Others made cruel jokes just loud enough for him to hear. "Look at Scarface over there," a young man laughed to his girlfriend. "What happened to him? Looks like he got in a fight with a lawnmower." The girlfriend giggled nervously. "Maybe he's not cut out for this job, literally." They burst into laughter at their own wit. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he remained motionless. This was nothing new. For the past 8 months since he'd been assigned to ceremonial duties, he'd endured the stares, the comments, the barely concealed disgust on people's faces. Some tourists were kinder, offering sympathetic smiles, but even those felt like pity. He preferred the cruel jokes to the pity. Behind him, he could hear his fellow guards shifting uncomfortably. They'd grown used to the attention Marcus attracted, but it still made them uneasy. Sergeant Williams had spoken to him about it just last week. "Maybe you should consider a transfer," Williams had suggested carefully. "Something behind the scenes. You've got the skills for intelligence work or training new recruits. This public-facing role, it's not for everyone." The suggestion had stung more than any tourist comment. Marcus had worked harder than anyone to earn his position. His service record was exemplary, his dedication unwavering. But none of that mattered when people looked at him and saw only damaged goods. A group of school children approached with their teacher, their voices bright with excitement. "Can we take a picture with the guard, Miss Henderson?" one little girl asked. The teacher glanced at Marcus and her expression faltered. She quickly steered the children toward another guard down the line. "Let's go see that one instead, children. He looks friendlier." The rejection hit Marcus like a physical blow. Children, at least, had been honest in their reactions. They'd stare with wide eyes and ask innocent questions, but now even they were being taught to avoid him. As the morning wore on, Marcus tried to focus on his duties. He loved this job, loved serving his country, loved being part of something bigger than himself. The uniform meant everything to him. It represented honor, tradition, sacrifice. It represented the man he'd worked so hard to become after everything he'd been through. But the comments continued. A middle-aged woman with a thick American accent pointed him out to her husband. "That poor man. What do you think happened to him?" "Probably some kind of accident," her husband replied. "Or maybe he was in the military. You know how those soldiers come back all messed up?" The woman shook her head sadly. "They shouldn't put him on display like this. It's not right." Marcus wanted to tell her that he wasn't on display. He was serving. He was protecting. He was doing the job he'd trained for and earned through years of dedication. But he remained silent as protocol demanded. The afternoon shift change approached, and Marcus could feel the tension in his shoulders from standing perfectly still for hours while enduring the scrutiny. As he prepared to step down from his post, a commotion erupted near the palace gates. A man in his 60s, wearing a worn leather jacket and walking with a slight limp, had gotten into an argument with one of the tourist guides. His voice carried across the courtyard, rough with emotion. "You don't know what you're talking about," the older man was saying. "These men deserve your respect, not your ignorant comments." The tour guide, a young woman with a patronizing smile, tried to calm him down. "Sir, I was simply explaining to the group about the different ceremonial roles." "Explaining?" The man's voice rose. "You were making jokes about that guard's appearance. I heard you. You called him damaged goods and suggested he was only fit for behind-the-scenes work." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He hadn't realized his humiliation was so public, so obvious that even strangers could pick up on it. The older man continued, his voice shaking with anger. "You have no idea what that man has been through, no idea what he's sacrificed. Those scars don't make him less of a soldier, they make him more of one." Security guards began moving toward the disturbance, but the older man wasn't causing trouble. He was just standing up for Marcus in a way no one had in months. Tourists started gathering, some filming with their phones, others looking uncomfortable at the confrontation. "Sir, please calm down," One of the security guards said gently. "We understand you're upset, but—" "No, you don't understand," the man interrupted, his eyes fixed on Marcus across the courtyard. "You see those scars and you think they tell a story of weakness. But some of us know better. Some of us can recognize the real story." The crowd had grown larger now and Marcus could feel all eyes on him. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. He didn't want to be the center of attention, didn't want to be defended like some charity case. He just wanted to do his job with dignity. But something about the older man's voice made him pause. There was a certainty there, a knowledge that went beyond mere sympathy. The man wasn't speaking from pity or political correctness. He was speaking from experience. As the security guards continued trying to defuse the situation, the older man's eyes met Marcus's across the courtyard. For a moment, despite the distance and the crowd between them, it felt like they were the only two people there. The man nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition that Marcus didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. The incident was quickly contained. The crowd dispersed and normal tourist activities resumed. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. Someone had seen beyond the scars, beyond the obvious damage, to something deeper. Someone had recognized him not as a victim, but as a warrior. As his shift ended and he prepared to leave his post, Marcus found himself wondering who the older man was and how he'd known to look beyond the surface. In a world that saw only his scars, someone had finally seen the soldier underneath. 3 days passed before Marcus saw the older man again. This time there was no commotion, no angry confrontation with tour guides. The man simply stood among the regular tourists, watching quietly as Marcus maintained his position outside the palace gates. But his presence felt different somehow, more intentional. Marcus had thought about their brief encounter constantly since that afternoon. The man's words echoed in his mind. Some of us can recognize the real story. What real story? What had he seen that others missed? The questions haunted Marcus during his off-duty hours, when he sat alone in his small flat, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The scars looked the same as always. Angry. Permanent. Ugly. He'd stopped trying to cover them with makeup months ago when he realized it only drew more attention. Now he just accepted them as part of who he was or who he'd become. His mobile phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah. "Mum's birthday next weekend. Will you come? She misses you." Marcus stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "On duty. Can't make it." It was a lie. He had the weekend off. But the thought of facing his family, seeing the worried looks in their eyes, the careful way they tried not to stare at his scars. It was easier to stay away. They loved him, he knew that. But love couldn't erase the discomfort. Love couldn't make him whole again. The next morning brought gray skies and a persistent drizzle that made the palace courtyard glisten like pewter. Tourists huddled under umbrellas, their enthusiasm dampened by the weather. Marcus preferred days like this. Fewer people meant fewer stares, fewer whispered comments. But the older man was there again, standing patiently in the rain without an umbrella. His gray hair was plastered to his head and his leather jacket darkened with moisture, but he seemed unbothered by the weather. He just watched, his eyes alert and knowing. During the lunch break, Marcus's fellow guard, Corporal Davies, approached him in the break room. "That old bloke's been asking about you," Davies said, unwrapping a sandwich. Marcus looked up sharply. "What kind of questions?" "Nothing invasive, just how long you've been here, what your background is." Security had a chat with him yesterday after that scene he caused. Turns out he's legit. Name's George Patterson. Former Royal Marines, served in Northern Ireland and the Falklands. Lost his son in Afghanistan 10 years ago. The information settled into Marcus's chest like a weight. A father who'd lost a soldier's son, now watching other soldiers with an intensity that suddenly made sense. What does he want? Davies shrugged. Didn't say. But he keeps coming back. Security's keeping an eye on him, but he's not causing any trouble, just watching. That afternoon, as Marcus took his position for the evening shift, he found himself scanning the crowd for George Patterson. The rain had stopped, but the skies remained heavy and gray. When he spotted the older man, their eyes met across the courtyard, and George nodded once before walking away. The gesture felt like a promise, though Marcus couldn't say what kind. 2 more days passed in the same pattern. George would appear, watch for a while, then leave without incident. Other tourists continued their usual behavior, but Marcus found himself less affected by their comments. Something about knowing George was there, seeing the understanding in his eyes, made the cruel words bounce off him more easily. On Friday afternoon, as Marcus finished his shift and changed out of his ceremonial uniform, he found a note tucked into his locker. The handwriting was careful and precise. "The Crown and Anchor Pub, Gloucester Road, 7 p.m. tonight. I'd like to buy you a drink. No questions if you don't want them. Just two soldiers sharing a pint. George Patterson." Marcus stared at the note for several minutes. His first instinct was to ignore it. He didn't need pity drinks from strangers, didn't want to become someone's charity project, but something about the tone of the note, the simple respect in calling him a soldier, made him reconsider. At 10 minutes past 7, Marcus pushed through the heavy wooden door of the Crown and Anchor. The pub was warm and dimly lit, filled with the comfortable noise of conversation and clinking glasses. He spotted George immediately, sitting alone at a corner table with 2 pints already waiting. "Wasn't sure you'd come," George said as Marcus approached. His voice was quieter than during the confrontation at the palace, but still carried that same note of certainty. "Wasn't sure I would either," Marcus admitted, taking the seat across from him. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, nursing their drinks. The pub buzzed with Friday evening energy around them, but their corner felt separate, private. "You remind me of my boy," George said eventually, his eyes fixed on his beer. "Jamie." He had that same look you get when people stare, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Davies told me." "I'm sorry for your loss," George nodded slowly. 10 years next month. IED outside Kabul. He was on his second tour, had 6 months left before coming home. He took a long sip of his beer. The thing is, he came back from his first tour different. Not just the usual readjustment stuff. He was marked. Not physically like you, but marked all the same. The older man's eyes finally met Marcus's. He used to say the hardest part wasn't what happened over there. It was coming home and having people look at him like he was broken, like he was something to be pitied or feared or hidden away. Marcus felt his chest tighten with recognition. "What did you tell him?" That being marked by service isn't the same as being damaged by it. That the people who can't see the difference don't matter. George's voice grew stronger, but it took me too long to say it. By the time I really understood what he was going through, he was gone again. Second tour. They drank in silence again, but it felt different now. Less awkward, more respectful. "Those scars of yours," George said carefully. "They tell a story. Not the story people think they see, but the real one, the one that matters." Marcus set down his glass harder than he intended. "You don't know anything about my story." "No," George agreed. "But I know something about stories that leave marks. And I know the difference between a victim and a survivor." The words hung between them like a challenge. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but underneath it was something else. Something that felt almost like hope. "Why do you care?" Marcus asked. "You don't know me." George smiled for the first time and his whole face changed. "Because Jamie would have wanted someone to care about the soldiers who came after him. Because you stand at that palace every day with your head high despite what people say and think. Because you're still serving, still fighting, still showing up." He leaned forward slightly. "And because I've seen that tattoo on your wrist." Marcus instinctively pulled his sleeve down, covering the small tattoo on his inner wrist. It was barely visible, just a simple design that most people would overlook entirely. But George had seen it, and from the look in his eyes, he understood what it meant. "You noticed that, did you?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a warning. George nodded slowly. "Hard to miss when you know what to look for." "The parachute regiment wings, right? With the date underneath?" Marcus felt his world shift slightly. For months, nobody had recognized the significance of anything about him except his scars. Everyone saw the obvious damage but missed the deeper story. But this old Marine had spotted a tattoo that was barely 2 inches wide and hidden beneath his uniform sleeve. "How did you—" Marcus began, then stopped. The answer was obvious. George's son Jamie had probably worn similar marks of service. Jamie had his Royal Marines tattoo in the same spot. George explained, his voice gentle. Said it was close to his pulse so he'd never forget who he was, no matter what else happened to him. Marcus looked down at his covered wrist. He'd gotten the tattoo during recovery, when the doctors weren't sure if he'd ever serve again. The wings represented everything he'd worked for, everything he'd almost lost. The date underneath marked the day his unit had been ambushed in Helmand Province. The day everything changed. The scars. George continued carefully. They're from the same incident, aren't they? Marcus took a long drink of his beer, buying time. He'd never talked about that day with anyone outside of the military medical staff and psychiatrists. The official reports were classified. His family knew only the basics. There'd been an incident, he'd been injured, he'd spent months in recovery. We don't need to talk about it, George said, sensing his reluctance. But I want you to know that someone sees the whole picture. Not just the damage, but the service. Not just what was taken from you, but what you gave. The pub had grown busier as the evening progressed, but their corner remained an island of quiet conversation. Marcus watched the other patrons, normal people enjoying normal Friday nights. None of them carried the weight he and George shared, the understanding that came from serving something larger than themselves. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, Marcus found himself saying. We'd done the same route dozens of times. But someone had been watching us, learning our patterns. George didn't respond, just listened with the patience of someone who'd heard similar stories before. The IED was just the beginning. They had snipers positioned on both sides of the road. My sergeant was killed in the first explosion. 3 others were wounded. I was trying to get to them when the sniper got me. Marcus touched his scars unconsciously. High-velocity round. Should have killed me outright, but the angle was off. Tore through the left side of my face instead. Shattered my cheekbone, damaged my jaw, left me looking like this. But you got your men out, George said. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked up sharply. How do you know that? Because you're here. Because you still wear that uniform with pride despite everything. Because you carry yourself like someone who did what needed doing, not someone who failed. They sat in silence for several minutes. Marcus felt something loosening in his chest. A tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The worst part wasn't the injury, he said finally. It was coming back and realizing that people couldn't see past it. The scars became all I was. Not a paratrooper, not a soldier who'd served 3 tours, not someone who'd saved lives. Just a damaged man who made people uncomfortable. George's jaw tightened with anger. That's the real crime. Not what happened to you over there, but how you've been treated since coming home. My commanding officer recommended me for ceremonial duties because he thought it would be good for my confidence, Marcus continued. Said interacting with the public would help me readjust. He meant well, but standing there while people gawk at your scars isn't exactly therapeutic, George finished. The children are the worst, Marcus admitted. Not because they're cruel, but because they're honest. They stare because they're curious, not malicious. But their parents pull them away like I'm dangerous. Like whatever happened to me might be contagious. George leaned forward, his voice intense. Listen to me carefully. What happened to you over there? What you did for your men, what you've endured since coming home, that's not a story of damage. That's a story of heroism. The people who can't see that are blind. Easy to say, Marcus replied. Harder to believe when you're living it every day. I know it is. Jamie struggled with the same thing in his own way. The guilt, the isolation, the feeling that you're being judged for things people could never understand. George's voice cracked slightly. I wish I'd been better at helping him see his own worth. Marcus felt a surge of protective anger for this man's lost son. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known. No, but I could have fought harder for him. Could have made sure he knew that the opinions of people who've never served don't matter. Could have reminded him daily that he was a hero, not a casualty. George reached across the table and tapped the spot where Marcus's tattoo was hidden. That mark you carry, it means something. It represents brothers who didn't make it home, missions accomplished under impossible circumstances, sacrifices made in service of something bigger than yourself. Don't let ignorant people convince you it means anything less. Marcus felt tears threatening and fought them back. He'd trained himself not to show emotion in public. But George's words were cutting through defenses he'd built over months of enduring public scrutiny. The thing is, Marcus said, his voice rough, I still love serving. I still believe in what we do. But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing more harm than good being so visible. People see me and they see failure, not service. Then we need to change what people see, George said firmly. We need to help them understand what they're really looking at when they look at you. Marcus met his eyes, seeing something like determination there. What are you suggesting? George smiled, and for the first time Marcus could see the mischievous spirit that had probably driven him through decades of military service. I'm suggesting that you've been fighting this battle alone for too long. Maybe it's time you had some backup. The following Monday morning brought crisp autumn air and the usual crowd of tourists to Buckingham Palace. Marcus took his position with the familiar weight of his ceremonial rifle and the steady rhythm of practiced duty. But something felt different. For the first time in months, he wasn't dreading the stares and whispered comments. George's words from Friday night echoed in his mind. Maybe it's time you had some backup. They'd parted ways that evening without making specific plans, but Marcus sensed something had shifted between them. An alliance had been formed, even if he wasn't sure what it meant yet. The morning progressed normally until around 10 o'clock, when Marcus noticed George approaching with two other men. Both appeared to be in their 60s, walking with the upright bearing that marked career military. One was tall and lean with silver hair, the other shorter and stockier with a well-trimmed gray beard. They positioned themselves near the fence where Marcus was stationed. Not directly in front, but close enough to be seen. George caught his eye briefly and nodded, then began speaking to his companions in a voice clearly meant to be overheard. "That's Marcus Thompson," George said, his tone carrying the respect of one soldier speaking about another. "Para-regiment, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Saved 4 men under sniper fire in Helmand." The tall man, who Marcus could now see wore a Royal Navy pin on his jacket lapel, looked directly at him with undisguised respect. "Takes courage to stay in service after an injury like that. Easier to take the medical discharge and disappear. That's what I told my grandson," the bearded man added, his Scottish accent thick with emotion. "I said, look at that soldier. That's what dedication looks like. That's what it means to serve your country no matter what." A small group of tourists had begun gathering nearby, drawn by the unusual conversation. Instead of the usual snickering and pointing, they listened with growing interest as George continued. "People see the scars and think they tell a story of failure," George said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "But those marks are evidence of success. Evidence that when his mates were in danger, he didn't hesitate. Evidence that when it mattered most, he chose their lives over his own safety." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion, but this time it wasn't shame or anger. It was something closer to pride, a feeling he'd almost forgotten how to experience. A middle-aged woman approached the group tentatively. "Excuse me, are you saying that guard was injured in combat?" "That guard," George corrected gently but firmly, "is a decorated veteran who earned those scars protecting his fellow soldiers. He's not just standing there for ceremony. He's standing there as a reminder of what courage looks like." The woman looked at Marcus with new eyes, her expression shifting from casual curiosity to genuine respect. "I had no idea. I thought the ceremonial guards were just for show." "This one's the real thing," the Navy veteran said. "And he's still serving, still standing proud despite everything he's been through. That's the kind of man you want protecting your country." More tourists began gathering, drawn by the conversation. Marcus could feel their attention, but it felt different now. Instead of being gawked at like a curiosity, he was being discussed as a hero. The distinction was overwhelming. A young father with his son asked, "What happened to him exactly?" George looked directly at Marcus, asking permission with his eyes. Marcus gave the slightest nod, trusting this man who'd already shown more understanding than anyone else. "His unit was ambushed while trying to reach wounded soldiers," George explained. "He could have stayed in cover, waited for backup. Instead, he went after his mates. Sniper got him in the face, but he kept going. Got all 4 men to safety before he'd let the medics work on him." The little boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "Daddy, is he a hero?" "Yes, son," the father replied quietly. "He's definitely a hero." Throughout this exchange, Marcus maintained his ceremonial stillness, but inside he was reeling. For months he'd been an object of pity or mockery. Now, suddenly, strangers were looking at him with admiration and respect. The crowd began to disperse gradually, but the word spread. Marcus could hear fragments of conversation as people passed. Injured in combat, saved his fellow soldiers, still serving despite everything. During his lunch break, Sergeant Williams approached him with a puzzled expression. "Something's different out there today. The tourists are behaving respectfully. Some of them are even saluting you." "What's going on?" Marcus explained about George and his companions. about the conversation that morning. Williams listened with growing amazement. "That's brilliant," Williams said finally. "Absolutely brilliant. Instead of trying to hide your service record, they're making it visible. They're giving people the context they need to understand what they're looking at." "It feels strange," Marcus admitted. "Good strange, but strange. I'm not used to people seeing me as anything other than damaged goods." "Maybe it's time you got used to it," Williams replied. "Because from where I'm standing, that old Marine has done something the brass never figured out. He's turned your greatest vulnerability into your greatest strength." The afternoon shift brought even more visitors, and Marcus noticed that George's morning intervention had created a ripple effect. People approached him differently, spoke about him in hushed, respectful tones. Several visitors asked the other guards about him specifically. Corporal Davies reported during the evening changeover, "Had at least a dozen people ask me about your service today. Word's getting around that we've got a proper war hero on ceremonial duty. Some American tourist even asked for your autograph." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the attention, but it was a different kind of overwhelming than he'd experienced in months. This was positive, affirming, respectful. It made him remember why he'd been so proud to put on the uniform in the first place. As his shift ended, he found another note in his locker, again in George's careful handwriting. "Crown and Anchor, same time tomorrow. Bring your dress uniform. We're just getting started." That evening, Marcus sat in his flat staring at his dress uniform hanging in the wardrobe. He hadn't worn it since the ceremony where he'd received his medals. Hadn't wanted to call attention to his commendations when people could barely look past his scars. But George had seen the tattoo, had recognized the wings, had understood the story the scars really told. If there were others like him, others who could see past the surface damage to the service underneath, maybe it was time to let those medals see daylight again. For the first time since his injury, Marcus allowed himself to feel proud of what he'd accomplished, what he'd endured, what he'd overcome. George was right. He wasn't a casualty of war. He was a survivor, a hero, a soldier who'd earned his place in that uniform through blood and sacrifice and unwavering dedication. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd remind the world what a real soldier looked like. Tuesday evening at the Crown and Anchor, Marcus walked through the door wearing his dress uniform for the first time in over a year. The dark blue fabric was immaculate, the brass buttons gleaming, and across his chest hung the medals he'd earned through 3 tours of duty: the Military Cross, the Operational Service Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, and others that told the story of his service in ways words never could. George was waiting at the same corner table, but he wasn't alone. The 2 men from that morning were there, along with 3 others Marcus didn't recognize. All were older, all carried themselves with military bearing, and all stood as he approached. "Marcus," George said, his voice thick with emotion, "meet the 8th Battalion Reunion Committee." The tall Navy veteran extended his hand first. "Commander James Fletcher, Royal Navy, retired. Served in the Falklands and Gulf War." His handshake was firm, his eyes respectful. "It's an honor to meet you, son," the bearded Scotsman followed. "Sergeant Major Hugh MacLeod, Black Watch, retired. 2 tours in Northern Ireland, 1 in Iraq." He gripped Marcus's hand with both of his own. "You're a credit to the uniform, lad." One by one, they introduced themselves: a former RAF pilot, an Army medic who'd served in Bosnia, a Royal Engineer who'd done 3 tours in Iraq. Each man had decades of service behind him. Each carried his own invisible scars, and each looked at Marcus with the recognition that only comes from shared understanding. "George told us what's been happening at the palace," Commander Fletcher said as they all sat down. "How the tourists have been treating you. That's not acceptable." "It's not their fault," Marcus replied automatically. "They don't understand exactly the problem," Sergeant Major MacLeod interrupted, his Scottish accent thickening with anger. "They don't understand because nobody's teaching them. They see a soldier in uniform and think it's just for show. They need to learn what real service looks like." The RAF pilot, Wing Commander Sarah Chen, leaned forward. "George's intervention yesterday was just the beginning. We've been talking and we think it's time for something bigger." Marcus looked around the table at these veteran faces, seeing determination and purpose that reminded him of mission briefings from his active duty days. "What are you suggesting?" George pulled out a folder thick with papers. "We're suggesting Operation Recognition, a coordinated effort to educate the public about what they're really seeing when they look at ceremonial guards." He spread out photographs and documents across the table. Marcus saw images of himself in uniform, but also official service records, commendation letters, and newspaper clippings he didn't recognize. "We've been doing our homework," Commander Fletcher explained. "Your commanding officer was very helpful once we explained what we were trying to accomplish. Did you know there was a newspaper article about your actions in Helmand? Small piece in the local paper back home, but it's there." Marcus stared at the clipping. He'd never seen it before. Never known his hometown had even been informed of his service. The headline read, "Local hero saves 4 lives in Afghanistan battle." "Your family gave us this," Wing Commander Chen added gently, pushing another photograph across the table. It showed Marcus before his injury, young and unmarked, standing proudly with his unit. "They're very proud of you, by the way. Your sister Sarah says to tell you that hiding from them isn't protecting them." Marcus felt his throat constrict. He'd been so focused on sparing his family the sight of his scars that he'd never considered how his absence might be hurting them. "The plan is simple," George continued. "We establish a presence at the palace. Not just random comments like yesterday, but organized education. We tell your story and the stories of other guards who've served in combat. We make sure people understand what they're looking at." Sergeant Major McLeod spread out a duty roster. "We'll work in shifts, different groups each day. George has already spoken to palace security, and they're supportive as long as we keep it respectful and educational." "But why?" Marcus asked, still overwhelmed by the scope of what they were proposing. "Why go to all this trouble for one person?" The table fell silent for a moment. Then Wing Commander Chen spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Because you're not one person. You're every soldier who's come home marked by service and been treated like damaged goods. You're every veteran who's been made to feel ashamed of the price they paid for their country." Commander Fletcher nodded. "We failed George's boy Jamie. We let him come home to a world that didn't understand or appreciate what he'd been through. We can't bring him back, but we can make sure other soldiers don't face that same isolation." George's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Jamie used to say he felt invisible, not because people didn't see him, but because they saw him and looked away. Made him feel like his service didn't matter, like what he'd been through was something shameful." "Your service matters," Sergeant Major McLeod said firmly. "What you did matters. What you continue to do every day, standing at that post despite everything. That matters too." Marcus looked around the table at these men and women who barely knew him but were willing to invest time and effort in defending his honor. It was overwhelming and humbling and terrifying all at once. "There's something else," George said, pulling out one final document. "We've been in contact with other veteran groups around London. The Royal British Legion, Help for Heroes, several regimental associations. They want to be part of this too." The document was a petition, already bearing hundreds of signatures calling for better recognition and support for wounded veterans in public service roles. Marcus's name was mentioned specifically, but the scope was much broader. "This isn't just about you anymore," Wing Commander Chen explained. "This is about changing how society views and treats wounded warriors. You've become a symbol whether you intended to or not." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was familiar but different. The weight of representing something larger than himself. During his active duty, he'd carried the responsibility for his men's lives. Now it seemed he was being asked to carry the responsibility for how society viewed wounded veterans. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course," George replied. "But while you're thinking, remember this. You have a choice. You can continue standing at that post alone, enduring the stares and comments, hoping things will gradually improve. Or you can stand there with backup, with people who understand what you represent and are willing to fight for that recognition." As the evening wound down and the other veterans gradually departed, George remained behind with Marcus. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, nursing their beers and processing the magnitude of what had been proposed. "They're good people," George said finally. "All of them have carried their own burdens, their own invisible wounds. They see in you a chance to do something meaningful, to honor not just your service but the service of everyone who's come home changed." Marcus fingered his medal ribbons absently. "It's a lot of responsibility." "Yes, it is. But you've carried responsibility before. The question is, are you ready to carry it again?" 3 months later, Marcus stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace on a bright spring morning, but the world around him had transformed completely. Where once tourists had whispered cruel jokes and pointed at his scars, Now they approached with respect and genuine interest. "Excuse me," a young woman said politely. "Are you the guard who was injured saving his fellow soldiers in Afghanistan?" Marcus maintained his ceremonial stillness, but nearby, Wing Commander Chen stepped forward with a warm smile. She wore a small badge identifying her as a palace volunteer guide, part of the official program that had grown out of Operation Recognition. "That's correct," Chen said proudly. "This is Corporal Marcus Thompson, Military Cross recipient. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was wounded while rescuing 4 members of his unit under enemy fire." The tourist looked at Marcus with undisguised admiration. "Would it be appropriate to thank him for his service?" "Absolutely," Chen replied. "Though he won't be able to respond while on duty, I can assure you he appreciates the recognition." The woman stepped closer to Marcus and spoke quietly. "Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. You're a true hero." This scene repeated itself dozens of times each day now. The veteran volunteers had become an integral part of the palace experience, educating visitors about the real stories behind the ceremonial uniforms. Marcus was no longer an object of curiosity or pity, but a respected symbol of military courage and dedication. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first weeks of Operation Recognition had been challenging, as the veteran volunteers learned to work within palace protocol while still accomplishing their mission. But gradually, their respectful and educational approach had won over both security, staff, and palace administration. The breakthrough had come when a group of visiting dignitaries from the Commonwealth countries had specifically requested to meet Marcus after hearing his story from George. The positive publicity that followed had convinced palace officials to formalize the veteran volunteer program. Now Marcus's story was featured in official palace materials. His photograph, proudly displaying his medals and scars, hung in the visitor's center, alongside information about the history and significance of the Royal Guard. School groups touring. The palace learned about his service as part of their educational experience, but perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. During his lunch break, Marcus received a text message from his sister Sarah. "Mum's 65th birthday party this weekend. Please come. The whole family wants to celebrate with our hero." This time he texted back immediately, "I'll be there. Looking forward to it." The relationship with his family had slowly healed as Marcus learned to see himself through their eyes rather than through his own shame. His scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined him. They were simply part of his story, not the entire narrative. "Big crowd today," George observed as he approached Marcus's position. At 72, George had become the unofficial leader of the veteran volunteers, coordinating schedules and training new volunteers in the art of respectful education. "Spring weather brings them out," Marcus replied quietly during a brief lull between tourist groups. George nodded toward a group of teenagers who were listening intently as Sergeant Major McLeod explained the significance of different military medals. "That's the future right there. Kids who will grow up understanding what service means, what sacrifice looks like." One of the teenagers, a girl about 16, approached Marcus hesitantly. "My grandfather was in the Navy during the Falklands War," she said. "He has scars too, but he never talks about them. Seeing you here, standing proud, it helps me understand him better." The girl's words hit Marcus with unexpected force. He was no longer just representing himself or even wounded veterans in general. He was helping bridge the gap between generations, helping families understand their own heroes. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus noticed a familiar figure in the crowd. A man in his 50s wearing a Royal Marines Association t-shirt stood watching quietly. His left sleeve was empty, pinned up at the shoulder, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone still adjusting to his limitations. During the shift change, the man approached George. "I heard about what you're doing here," he said. "My name's David Collins. I lost my arm in Helmand 2 years ago. Been struggling with how people look at me." George's face lit up with understanding. "Would you like to be part of this? We could use more volunteers, especially someone with recent combat experience." David looked at Marcus, who was now out of his ceremonial position and could speak freely. "Does it help? Being here, being seen?" "It saved my life," Marcus answered honestly. "Not physically, but everything else. I was disappearing, becoming invisible even to myself. This gave me purpose again, reminded me that what we did mattered." Over the following weeks, David joined the volunteer team and his presence added another dimension to the program. Visitors could see the full spectrum of military service and sacrifice, from George's generation to David's, with Marcus representing the bridge between them. The program's success had attracted national attention. Marcus found himself invited to speak at veteran events, military academies, and government functions about the importance of recognizing and supporting wounded warriors. He'd never imagined himself as a public speaker, but the words came easily when he talked about something he believed in deeply. One evening at the Crown and Anchor, the original team gathered to celebrate the program's 6-month anniversary. The pub had become their unofficial headquarters, and the landlord had designated their corner table with a small plaque, "Reserved for Heroes." "I got a call from the Ministry of Defense today," Commander Fletcher announced. "They want to implement similar programs at other royal residences and ceremonial sites across the country." Wing Commander Chen raised her glass. "To Operation Recognition and to the man who made it all possible." "To all of us who made it possible," Marcus corrected. "I was just the excuse. You were the ones who saw the opportunity and had the courage to act on it." George smiled across the table at him. "Jamie would be proud. Of all of us, but especially of you. You took what could have been a bitter ending and turned it into a hopeful beginning." As the evening wound down and the other veterans gradually departed, Marcus found himself alone with George, as they had been that first night 6 months ago. "But everything had changed since then. Any regrets?" George asked. Marcus touched his scars unconsciously, a habit that had evolved from shame to simple acknowledgement. "None. Well, maybe one. What's that? I wish I'd trusted people to see beyond the surface sooner. I spent so much time hiding that I almost missed the chance to make a difference." George nodded thoughtfully. "We all have invisible wounds along with the visible ones. Sometimes it takes courage to let people see both." As they prepared to leave, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from David. "First speaking engagement tomorrow at the local school. Nervous but excited. Thanks for showing me that broken doesn't mean finished." Marcus showed the message to George, who smiled with deep satisfaction. That's how it spreads. One person finding their courage inspires another to find theirs. Walking home through the London streets, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had transformed. The same scars that had once made him hide in shame now served as visible proof of his service and sacrifice. The uniform that had felt like a burden now fit him like armor forged from purpose and pride. Tomorrow he would return to his post at Buckingham Palace, where hundreds of visitors would see him not as damaged goods but as a hero still serving his country. Children would learn about courage by looking at his face. Veterans would find hope in his example. And somewhere, maybe another wounded warrior would realize that their story wasn't ending but just beginning a new chapter. The scars would always be there, would always tell their story of violence and pain and loss. But now they told a larger story too, of survival and service and the unbreakable spirit of those who choose to stand guard, to serve others, to find meaning in sacrifice. Marcus Thompson had learned to wear his wounds like medals, because that's exactly what they were,